The sound of splintering wood was the only sermon this church had heard in months. Another shingle tore loose from the roof, clattering down to the muddy ground below. It was a sound Sarah Mitchell knew better than prayer. She pressed her back against the cold, hard altar, her eyes locked on the man framed in the doorway. He was a silhouette against the gray Montana sky, a cowboy with his hat in his hands, mud on his boots, and a storm in his eyes that had nothing to do with the weather. He looked like a man who'd lost a fight with God himself, and maybe he had. Jake Rawlings whispered her name, or maybe it was a curse. His voice was rough, like gravel scraped over rock. He was looking at the preacher's widow, the woman who'd been watching his daughter while his whole world burned down around him. He thought he saw tears in her eyes, tears for his pain, for his loss. But Sarah wasn't crying for him. She was crying for what he was about to ask, and what she was about to do. Life as a preacher's widow wasn't supposed to look like this. It wasn't supposed to taste of sawdust and fear. But 3 months after Reverend Thomas Mitchell had been laid in the cold ground, Sarah was fighting to hold together the only 2 things he'd left her: a crumbling church and a town full of broken people. Back east, they'd have called her unladylike. At 27, she could shoe a horse faster than the blacksmith and patch a roof with the grim determination of a woman who knew what it meant to be alone. The frontier didn't care about propriety. It only cared about survival. And Sarah was a survivor. The church bell tower swayed in the October wind like a drunken man, a constant, groaning reminder that she was running out of time. Snow was coming. She'd written to the territorial office, begged for help, for funds, for anything. The answer was a cold, hard no. The congregation was small, ranchers scattered across the plains, and they'd already given what little they had. That's when he'd shown up. Jake Rawlings. Everyone in Pine Ridge had a story about him. The rich cattle rancher whose wife, Mary, had been taken by a sudden fever 2 years ago. The man who'd been trying to drown his memories in a bottle of whiskey ever since. His 10-year-old daughter, Emma, was a ghost herself, passed between families in town, a little girl with her father's haunted green eyes and a toughness that no child should ever have to learn. Mrs. Mitchell. Jake's voice cut through the empty sanctuary, his boots echoing on the warped floorboards. He stepped into the light, and Sarah saw the desperation etched into the lines of his face. Emma tells me you're fixing this place yourself. Sarah straightened up, wiping her calloused hands on her work apron. She knew what she looked like. Not a preacher's gentle wife, but a woman carved from the wilderness itself. Mr. Rawlings. Emma is in the back, practicing her letters. He didn't move toward his daughter. He couldn't. Instead, his eyes swept over the church, over the makeshift scaffolding, the scattered tools, the evidence of her lonely, desperate work. He looked at her hands, and for a moment, she thought she saw respect in his gaze. Or maybe it was pity. "This is dangerous work for a woman," he said, his voice low. "It's necessary work," she shot back, her chin high. "And I am not helpless." Something flickered in his eyes. He turned his dusty hat over and over in his hands, a nervous gesture that seemed out of place on such a hard man. "I have a proposition." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She waited. Jake Rawlings was a shadow, a warning, but he was also the only person who'd offered anything resembling help. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that fell over his brow and eyes that held a world of pain. He looked like a man who'd forgotten how to hope. "I need help with Emma," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "And you need help with this church." It wasn't a question. "I'll fix your roof," he went on, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. "I'll brace the bell tower. I'll make this place strong enough to withstand 100 winters. In exchange—" He paused, and the air grew thick with unspoken things. "You become her governess, officially. You keep looking after her." The words were a slap in the face. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him that his daughter didn't need a governess, she needed a father. "She needs you, Mr. Rawlings." His jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in his cheek. "Her father," he said, the words dripping with self-loathing, "is barely fit for the company of pigs these days, let alone a child." "Then perhaps it's time you cleaned out the sty." The challenge hung in the air between them, sharp and dangerous. Sarah had learned long ago that the frontier didn't reward soft words, but as she watched him, she saw a crack appear in his armor, a glimpse of the man who was buried under 2 years of guilt and whiskey. "The arrangement stands," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Repairs for the church. Care for my daughter. Nothing more." Sarah looked around the broken sanctuary. She thought of Emma's fierce, lonely eyes. This wasn't just about a roof. It was about saving a little girl. And maybe, just maybe, it was about saving the man who stood before her, even if he didn't believe he was worth saving. He needed a reason to put down the bottle. He needed a purpose. But Sarah had a secret of her own. A reason she couldn't leave this town, a reason this church had to stand. "Very well," she agreed, her voice steady. "But I have conditions, and you won't like them." He arrived at dawn, a toolbox in one hand and a thermos of coffee in the other that smelled strong enough to raise the dead. But Sarah was already on the roof. She'd been working since the first hint of light, a solitary figure against the rising sun. She heard his sharp intake of breath as he saw her, balanced on the steep incline as if she'd been born there. "That woman is going to get herself killed," he muttered, just loud enough for the wind to carry his words up to her. "I've been managing just fine for months, Mr. Rawlings," she called down, a smile touching her lips for the first time that day. "Though I admit, an extra pair of hands will be welcome." He climbed the ladder, moving with an easy, practiced grace that told her he was no stranger to hard work. They worked side by side, the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of their hammers the only sound between them. Sarah found herself stealing glances at him, at the strength in his hands as he laid new shingles, at the way his worn shirt stretched across his broad shoulders. He worked with a grim focus, as if he was trying to beat his demons into submission with every nail he drove. "You do good work," he said after an hour of silence, his voice startling her. "You sound surprised." "Maybe I am." He paused, his hammer resting on a shingle. His eyes, clear and green in the morning light, met hers. "Your husband, Thomas, he was a lucky man." A cold fist squeezed Sarah's heart. "Thomas needed a wife who could play the church organ and serve tea to the Ladies' Aid Society," she said, her voice flat. "He got a woman who could birth a calf in a blizzard and stitch a man's arm back on." Jake looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. "Sounds to me like he got the better deal." Across the wide expanse of the roof, something passed between them. A spark of understanding, a flicker of warmth that Sarah thought had died with her husband's quiet, constant disappointment in her. Thomas had wanted a porcelain doll. The frontier had given him an iron nail. "Papa! Mrs. Mitchell!" a small voice called up from below. "I made breakfast." The spell was broken. Jake's face shuttered, the brief connection vanishing like smoke. He stood up, ready to flee. "I should go." "She made it for both of us," Sarah said gently, her heart aching for the little girl who was trying so hard. "It would break her heart if you left." He looked trapped, torn between his demons and his daughter. And in that moment, Sarah understood. It wasn't just grief that kept him away from Emma. It was fear. He was terrified of failing her, just like he believed he'd failed her mother. "One breakfast, Jake?" she pressed, using his first name for the first time. "For Emma." The kitchen was filled with the smell of slightly burned biscuits and coffee that could peel paint. But Emma served it with a proud smile that lit up her face, and they both ate every last crumb, praising her like she was the finest chef in the territory. Sarah watched them. She saw the slight tremor in Jake's hand as he lifted his cup. She saw the way he kept glancing at the door, a caged animal looking for an escape. But Emma, oblivious or perhaps just refusing to see, chattered on about her lessons, about a new foal at a neighboring ranch, about everything and nothing. She was weaving a web of happy words, trying to trap her father in it, to keep him there with her. And slowly, incredibly, it started to work. Jake's shoulders began to relax. He started to answer Emma's questions, a real smile even touching his lips when she announced her grand plan to become a famous horse trainer. "Just like Mrs. Mitchell," Emma declared, her eyes shining. "She can break any horse, can't you, Mrs. Mitchell?" Sarah nearly choked on her coffee. "Emma, I've never claimed such a thing." "But you could," the girl insisted with unshakable faith. "You can do anything." Over the top of his daughter's head, Jake's eyes met Sarah's. The look in them was different now. It wasn't pity or surprise. It was something closer to awe, and it sent a shiver down Sarah's spine because Jake Rawlings was starting to see her. But what he didn't see, what no one in Pine Ridge saw, was the letter hidden in the back of Sarah's Bible. The letter from her family back east, disowning her. The letter that hinted at the real reason Reverend Thomas Mitchell had fled to the frontier. Her husband hadn't been running to God. He'd been running from something. And Sarah was afraid it had finally followed them here. The days found a new rhythm, marked by the sound of hammers and the bright, hopeful sound of Emma's laughter. Jake arrived with the sun each morning, and they worked shoulder to shoulder, rebuilding the church that was becoming a symbol of their own fragile repairs. He was more than just a skilled laborer. When they discovered a deep, dangerous crack in the main support beam of the bell tower, a problem that made Sarah's blood run cold, Jake didn't panic. He stared at it for a long, silent hour, his mind working behind those haunted eyes. Then, with a piece of charcoal on a spare plank, he sketched out an ingenious bracing system, a web of supports that would distribute the weight and hold the tower secure. "Where did you learn to do that?" Sarah asked, watching in amazement as he fit the salvaged timbers together with the precision of a master craftsman. "My father was a ship's carpenter," Jake said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. He was securing a brace, his focus absolute. "Before we came west. He always said the principles were the same. Whether you're building for an ocean storm or a prairie blizzard, you have to respect the forces that are trying to tear your work apart." He spoke of his father with a warmth that was laced with an old, familiar grief. Sarah saw a glimpse of the man he'd been before his wife's death, a man who knew how to build things, not just break them. She found herself wanting to know all his stories, to trace the lines on his face back to a time before they were carved there by loss. But it was in the evenings, after Jake had ridden back to his silent ranch house, that the real work began. Sarah would sit with Emma by the fire, the girl's head bent over her school books. Emma was a sponge, soaking up knowledge, but what she was really starved for was connection. "Does Papa seem different to you, Mrs. Mitchell?" she asked one night, her small finger tracing the numbers of an arithmetic problem. Sarah chose her words with care. "Different how, sweet girl? He smiles more. When he's here. With you." The girl's voice dropped to a whisper. "But then he goes home, and the sadness comes back." Her young eyes were filled with a fear that broke Sarah's heart. She was terrified of losing him to the same darkness that had taken her mother. "Change takes time, Emma," Sarah said, her hand resting on the girl's shoulder. "Your father is carrying a heavy, heavy burden." She hesitated, then decided the girl deserved some piece of the truth. "He blames himself for your mama's death, for something that was never his fault." Emma was quiet for a long time, the firelight dancing in her eyes. "Will he ever stop being sad?" Sarah pulled the child into a gentle hug. "I think he's already started to. He just needs to believe he deserves to be happy again." Later that night, as Sarah lay in her narrow cot in the church rectory, the wind howling outside, she wasn't thinking of her late husband. She was thinking of Jake Rawlings. She remembered the way his face had softened when he looked at his daughter. She remembered the moment their hands had brushed when he'd passed her a hammer, and the jolt, like lightning, that had shot up her arm. She was a widow, a woman of God. She had no business thinking these things about a broken, grieving man who was still in love with the memory of his wife, but her heart, that stubborn, foolish thing, didn't seem to care about the rules. It was starting to beat a new rhythm, a dangerous rhythm that sounded a lot like hope. And as she drifted to sleep, she thought again of the letter in her Bible. The letter that spoke of Thomas's unfortunate business dealings and a debt that could not be repaid. She had thought this church, this town, was a refuge, but she was beginning to realize it was a cage, and the key was buried with a man who had taken his secrets to the grave. The crisis came like a thief in the night. No warning, just the frantic, desperate pounding on the church door that tore Sarah from a restless sleep. She threw open the heavy oak door to find Emma, barefoot in her thin nightgown, her small face streaked with tears and dirt. She had run the 2 miles from the ranch, in the dark, alone. "It's Papa," the girl gasped, her body trembling with cold and terror. He's hurt real bad. He was drinking again. He fell. There's so much blood, Mrs. Mitchell, I can't wake him up right." Every instinct Sarah had honed on the frontier screamed to life. There was no time for fear. She grabbed her medical bag, saddled her horse with a speed that defied the darkness, and pulled Emma up behind her. They rode like the devil was on their heels, the little girl's arms wrapped around her waist like a vice, her terrified sobs lost in the wind. The ranch house was a black shape against the stars, save for a single lamp that cast a sickly yellow glow from the kitchen window. She found him on the floor, sprawled beside an overturned chair and a shattered whiskey bottle. A deep gash on his forehead was bleeding freely onto the rough wooden planks. The air was thick with the stench of whiskey, but as Sarah knelt beside him, her fingers searching for a pulse, she knew this was more than just a drunken fall. His pulse was thready, his skin clammy. This was something worse. "Emma, I need you to be a brave girl for me," Sarah said, her voice a calm anchor in the chaos. "Light every lamp you can find, and bring me all the clean towels in this house, now." The girl, her eyes wide with fear but her spine stiff with resolve, scurried to obey. Sarah turned her attention back to Jake. The cut on his forehead was bad, deep enough to need stitches. But it was the angry-looking knot on the back of his head, where he'd struck the floor, that terrified her. She'd seen enough head wounds to know how quickly they could turn deadly. As she gently cleaned the blood from his face, preparing her needle and thread, his eyelids fluttered. He blinked, his green eyes unfocused, struggling to make sense of the face leaning over him. "Sarah?" His voice was a thick, confused rasp. "You took a bad fall, Jake," she said softly, her hands never ceasing their work. "Now hold still. This is going to hurt." He tried to push himself up, a groan escaping his lips. She pressed him back down, her touch firm but gentle. "Stay still. Emma is here, and she's seen enough fear for one night." The mention of his daughter's name seemed to cut through the fog. "Emma? She's fine. She's the one who came for me. She saved you." Sarah began the delicate task of stitching the wound, her focus absolute. "She was terrified she was going to lose you too, Jake." He closed his eyes, a shudder running through his body. Sarah couldn't tell if it was from the pain of the needle or the pain of her words. "God," he whispered, his voice cracking. "What kind of father am I?" "The kind who's hurting," Sarah replied, her own voice as steady as the hand pulling the thread tight. "The kind who's been carrying a weight that would crush most men, but also the kind whose daughter loves him enough to run 2 miles through the dark to save his life." As she tied off the final stitch, something on the floor caught her eye, half hidden under the overturned table. It wasn't a shard from the whiskey bottle. It was a single ornate cufflink made of silver and onyx. It wasn't Jake's. She recognized it instantly. It had belonged to her husband, the Reverend Thomas Mitchell, and it was stained with fresh blood. She helped Jake sit up slowly, her mind reeling. She checked his eyes, watched for any sign of concussion, but her thoughts were a whirlwind. What was Thomas's cufflink doing here? How did it get covered in Jake's blood? This wasn't a drunken fall. Jake had been attacked. "I'm staying," she announced, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You need to be watched, in case the wound gets worse." It was a lie. She wasn't staying to watch him. She was staying to protect him. Because whatever secret her husband had died with, it hadn't died with him. It was here, in this room, and it had just tried to kill again. They spent the rest of the night at that kitchen table, a strange, broken little family keeping vigil. Emma, exhausted but refusing to leave her father's side, curled up on a chair, her hand resting on his arm even in sleep. Sarah watched Jake, her gaze sharp, cataloging every breath, every flicker of his eyes, while her mind raced, trying to piece together an impossible puzzle. The cufflink felt heavy in her pocket, a cold, metallic secret. As the first gray light of dawn crept through the window, Jake finally broke the silence. Emma was still asleep, her breathing deep and even. "I keep seeing her face," he said, his voice hollow, staring into a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. "Mary, the day she got sick. I keep thinking, if I'd just been faster getting the doctor, if I'd noticed the fever sooner." The guilt poured out of him, a flood held back for 2 long years. He spoke of his frantic ride to town, of the gut-wrenching fear, of returning to find the house silent, his wife gone, his world shattered. The doctor said, "He said there was nothing anyone could have done," Jake whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. "He said the fever took her too fast, but a husband is supposed to protect his wife. I wasn't there." Sarah looked at this strong man, utterly broken by a grief he believed he'd earned. She thought about the cufflink in her pocket. She thought about the strange entries in Thomas's journal she'd found tucked away in the church attic, notes about land surveys and water rights near the Rawlings Ranch, things a preacher had no business knowing. "Jake," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "I don't think Mary's fever was just a fever." He looked up, his eyes filled with confusion. "What are you talking about?" She took a deep breath. It was a risk, a terrible risk. But something had happened in this room last night. Someone had tried to silence him. "My husband, Thomas, he wasn't the man people thought he was. He was involved in things concerning land and the people who owned it." She pulled the bloody cufflink from her pocket and placed it on the table between them. "I found this on the floor last night, after your fall." Jake stared at it, recognition dawning on his face. He'd seen it before, on the preacher's wrist. His mind, clearer now without the whiskey, began to work. He remembered the night before. Not all of it, but pieces. The sound of a horse outside, a knock at the door, an argument, not a fall, a fight. "Sheriff Brody," Jake breathed, the name coming out of the fog. "He was here. He was asking about Mary, asking if she'd mentioned anything unusual before she got sick." Sheriff Brody, the man who'd declared Mary's death a tragic act of nature and closed the case within a day. The man who was a close friend of Marcus Thorne, the wealthiest land baron in the territory, a man who had been trying to buy Jake's ranch for years. "He said I was a drunk, that my grief was making me crazy," Jake continued, his voice shaking with a new emotion. Not grief, but rage. "He said if I didn't sell my land to Thorne, he'd find a way to declare me an unfit father and take Emma from me." The pieces slammed into place with sickening clarity. Mary hadn't died from a fever. She'd been silenced, and Thomas, her preacher, had found out. He must have confronted them, threatened to expose them. And for his righteousness, he'd been murdered, his death staged to look like a riding accident. And last night, Sheriff Brody had come to finish the job, to silence Jake for good. Suddenly, the crumbling church wasn't just Sarah's home, it was evidence. The bell tower Jake was repairing wasn't just a structure, it was the last place Thomas had been seen alive. What if he'd hidden something there? Proof. Your fall wasn't an accident, Jake, Sarah said, her voice deadly calm. And my husband's death wasn't either. They killed them, and they're trying to take everything from you. The tears in Jake's eyes were gone, replaced by a cold, hard fire. The grief that had crippled him for 2 years was burning away, leaving behind a pure, terrifying rage. He wasn't just a broken man anymore. He was a man with nothing left to lose, and that made him the most dangerous man in Montana. They moved with the quiet urgency of soldiers behind enemy lines. While Emma still slept, Sarah told Jake everything she suspected about Thomas's hidden journal, the coded entries about water rights, and the name Thorne appearing over and over. They were no longer just a widow and a rancher. They were partners in a conspiracy that had already claimed 2 lives. The bell tower, Jake said, his voice a low growl. If Thomas knew he was in danger, he would have hidden the proof somewhere safe, somewhere holy. Somewhere he was working, Sarah finished, her mind racing. He was inspecting the supports the day he died. They had to get back to the church, but they couldn't leave Emma, and they couldn't trust anyone in town. Sheriff Brody had eyes everywhere. He would be watching the ranch, waiting to see if his little accident had worked. I'll create a diversion, Sarah said, her plan forming as she spoke. I'll ride into town, bold as brass. I'll go to the general store, talk to people, tell them you took a terrible fall and that I'm fetching supplies. I'll make sure everyone sees me. That will give you time. Time for what? To get to the church without being seen. Take the high trail through the rocks. It's longer, but you'll be hidden from the main road. Search that bell tower, Jake. Search every inch of it. Find what my husband died to protect. He looked at her, at this preacher's wife, who was now planning covert operations like a seasoned general. The awe in his eyes was back, mixed with a fierce, protective gratitude. He reached across the table, his calloused hand covering hers. Sarah, be careful. The frontier taught me to be more than careful, she said, her gaze steady. It taught me to be smart. She woke Emma gently, explaining that her father needed rest and that she was going to town for medicine. The little girl's eyes were still filled with fear, but she nodded, her trust in Sarah absolute. Sarah rode out from the ranch house, forcing herself to keep a calm, steady pace, even though every nerve screamed at her to gallop. She knew Brody's eyes, or the eyes of his deputies, would be on her. In town, she played her part perfectly. She expressed grave concern for Mr. Rawlings to the store owner. She bought bandages and laudanum, items that supported her story. She let the town gossips flutter around her, soaking up every detail of the tragic accident. Every minute she spent in that store was a minute bought for Jake. Meanwhile, Jake moved through the rugged terrain behind his ranch like a ghost. He left Emma barricaded in the house with a rifle and strict instructions not to open the door for anyone but him. The grief that had slowed his steps for 2 years was gone, replaced by a cold, clear purpose. He was no longer a victim. He was a hunter. He reached the church from the back, slipping through the graveyard like a shadow. He climbed the scaffolding to the bell tower, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He began to search, his hands running over every beam, every joint, every nail that he and Sarah had worked on together. He found it wedged deep inside a split in the main support beam, the very beam he had been repairing. It was a small, oilskin-wrapped package. His hands trembled as he tore it open, Inside was a sworn affidavit, written in Thomas Mitchell's elegant script. It detailed a conversation he had overheard between Marcus Thorne and Sheriff Brody. They spoke of poisoning Mary Rawlings's well with a slow-acting toxin derived from a local root, a poison that would mimic the symptoms of a swift and deadly fever. They laughed about how her drunken husband would be too consumed by guilt to ever question the doctor they had paid to sign the death certificate. It was all there. The proof. The murder weapon. The motive. The deep, clear aquifer that ran directly beneath Jake's land, an aquifer Thorne needed to irrigate the thousands of acres he planned to turn into a farming empire. But there was something else in the package. A second document. A deed. It was a deed to the Rawlings ranch, signed over to Marcus Thorne, and the signature at the bottom, the signature that gave away his land, his home, his daughter's future, was his own. He stared at the paper, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. He had never signed this. He would rather die. Then he remembered. A few months after Mary's death, Brody had brought him some papers to sign, something about taxes, he'd said. Jake had been blind drunk, drowning in sorrow. He'd signed without reading. He'd signed away everything without even knowing it. They hadn't just murdered his wife. They had played him for a fool, using his own grief to orchestrate his ruin. A floorboard creaked below him. Jake froze, his blood turning to ice. He wasn't alone. He peered down through a gap in the bell tower floor. Sheriff Brody was standing in the sanctuary, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. He was looking up, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "I figured you'd come sniffing around here eventually, Rawlings," the sheriff called out, his voice echoing in the empty church. "Did you find what the good Reverend left for you? Thorne and I have been looking for that for a while now." Brody started to climb the ladder. Jake was trapped, unarmed, with the evidence of his wife's murder in his hand. Below him, the man who had helped kill her was coming to finish the job. He was a dead man. Then he saw it. The bell rope. Thick, heavy, and coiled just a few feet away. He remembered what his father had taught him. You have to respect the forces that are trying to tear your work apart. And sometimes, you had to use those forces to your own advantage. The sheriff's head appeared through the trapdoor. His eyes widened as he saw the papers in Jake's hand. He drew his pistol, the click of the hammer cocking, echoing like a death knell. "Give me that, Rawlings," Brody snarled, "and I might just make your death look like an accident, too." But Jake wasn't looking at the gun. He was looking at the massive bronze bell hanging directly above the trapdoor. He was looking at the thick rope that held it in place. With a roar of pure rage, Jake grabbed a nearby hatchet, one of the tools they'd left behind, and swung it at the rope. The thick fibers groaned, then snapped. The world dissolved into a deafening chaos of sound and motion. The massive bell, freed from its mooring, didn't just ring. It fell. It plunged downwards with the force of a thunderclap, straight through the trap door where Sheriff Brody was standing. The man didn't even have time to scream. Jake was thrown backwards by the force of it, the precious documents scattering across the floor. He scrambled to his feet, his ears ringing, and looked down through the splintered hole. The sanctuary below was a wreck of shattered wood and twisted metal. The great bell lay half buried in the floorboards, and beneath it, there was nothing but silence. He had the proof. He had eliminated one of the killers. But the mastermind, Marcus Thorne, was still out there. A man with enough money and power to bury this story, to bury Jake with it. Just then, the main church doors burst open. Sarah stood there, her face pale, a rifle in her hands. She had heard the crash from town and had come running. Her eyes took in the scene, the destroyed sanctuary, the fallen bell, Jake standing above it all like an avenging angel. "Jake," she breathed, her voice filled with terror and awe. "What did you do?" He looked down at her, the affidavit clutched in his hand. I just rang the devil's doorbell, Sarah, he said, his voice deadly serious. And now Marcus Thorne is going to answer. Panic was a luxury they couldn't afford. Sarah didn't waste a second. While Jake gathered the scattered papers, his hands still shaking from adrenaline, she took charge. They'll have heard that crash for miles, she said, her mind working with cold, clear logic. People will be coming. We can't be found here with a dead sheriff. He was trying to kill me, Sarah. I know. But Marcus Thorne owns the judge, the marshals, everything. He'll twist this. He'll say you murdered a lawman in cold blood. That affidavit won't even see the inside of a courtroom. She looked around the wrecked sanctuary, her eyes sharp. We have to control the story. They dragged Brody's body from the wreckage, a grim and heavy task. They hid him in the old baptismal font in the sacristy, covering him with a heavy velvet cloth. It wouldn't hold for long, but they just needed a little time. We need leverage, Jake said, his mind catching up to hers. Something more than just this paper, something Thorne can't deny. His paid-off doctor, Sarah realized, the one who signed Mary's death certificate, Dr. Evans. He's a weak man. He has a wife and children. If we can get to him, make him confess. Thorne will have him guarded, or already silenced. Then we go straight to the source. Sarah's eyes glittered with a dangerous light that made her look less like a preacher's widow and more like a frontier vigilante. We go to Thorne's house. Tonight. It was insane. A suicidal plan. Marcus Thorne lived in a fortress on the edge of town, surrounded by hired guns. But as Jake looked at Sarah, he saw the same steely resolve that had gotten her up on that church roof day after day. She wasn't afraid. And if she wasn't afraid, he couldn't be either. They rode back to the ranch under the cover of approaching dusk. The first thing they saw was Emma, sitting on the porch step, the rifle laid across her lap, her small face a mask of fierce determination. She ran to them, flinging her arms around Jake's legs. I heard a loud noise, she said, her voice small. From the town. Everything is all right, sweet girl, Jake said, scooping her into his arms and holding her tight. Over her head, his eyes met Sarah's. They had to end this, for Emma. They waited until the moon was high. They dressed in dark clothes, their faces grim. Jake checked his rifle, his movements precise and deadly. Sarah, to his surprise, pulled a small, pearl-handled derringer from a hidden pocket in her dress. My father insisted I learn to use it, she said, seeing his shocked expression. He said the world was full of men like Marcus Thorne. They left Emma with a trusted neighbor, an old rancher's wife who owed Sarah for delivering her grandchild during a rough winter. They told her Jake was taking Sarah home, a simple lie to cover their desperate mission. Thorne's ranch was a sprawling mansion, lights blazing in every window, a flagrant display of wealth and power. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. Getting inside seemed impossible. We don't go through the front door, Sarah whispered, pulling Jake toward the dark shadows of the stables. We go through the back. She moved with a stealth that amazed him, slipping from shadow to shadow like she was born to it. She pointed to a small second-story window at the back of the house. That's his office. He keeps his account ledgers there. If there's a record of the payment to Dr. Evans, it will be in that room. It's too high. We'll never reach it. Sarah smiled grimly. She pointed to the thick ivy that covered the stone walls of the house. Thomas always said my skills were unbefitting a lady, she whispered, grabbing a thick vine. Tonight they might just save our lives. She climbed like a cat, finding holds in the stone and ivy, moving upward with a silent, terrifying grace. Jake, a man who'd spent his life on horseback and open plains, followed her, his heart in his throat. This woman, this preacher's widow, was unlike anyone he had ever known. They slipped through the unlocked window into Thorne's opulent office. It was a shrine to greed, filled with mahogany furniture, leather-bound books, and maps of the territory with Jake's land circled in red ink. Jake stood guard at the door, while Sarah moved to the massive desk, her fingers flying across the drawers, searching. She found the ledger almost immediately. Her finger ran down a page of entries, her breath catching in her throat. There it was. A large payment to A. Evans, dated 2 days after Mary's death. The memo line contained a single, chilling word: consultation. She had it, the final nail in his coffin. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Jake spun around, raising his rifle. The office door swung open. But it wasn't Marcus Thorne. It was Dr. Evans, his face ashen, his body trembling. "He knows," the doctor stammered, his eyes wide with terror. "One of the deputies saw the wreck at the church. They found Brody's body. Thorne knows you have the affidavit. He sent for me. He's going to kill me to tie up the loose ends." "Then help us," Sarah pleaded, holding up the ledger. "Testify against him. We can protect you." Before the doctor could answer, a cold, amused voice filled the room. "Protect him? You can't even protect yourselves." Marcus Thorne stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 of his hired guns. He was a big man, dressed in an expensive suit, a smug smile on his face. He held a shotgun, its twin barrels pointed directly at Jake's heart. "You've caused me a great deal of trouble, Mr. Rawlings," Thorne said conversationally. "And you, Mrs. Mitchell. I must say I'm surprised. The good Reverend never mentioned his wife was a cat burglar." He gestured with the shotgun. "Now, give me the affidavit and the ledger, and I'll consider giving you a quick death." It was over. They were trapped, outgunned. Jake stood his ground, his rifle still aimed at Thorne, but he knew it was hopeless. Then, behind Thorne, a small figure appeared in the darkened hallway. It was Emma. She had followed them. The brave, stubborn, terrified little girl had followed them right into the lion's den. She held her father's hunting knife in her small hand, her eyes blazing with a courage that mirrored her father's. Thorne hadn't seen her. His attention was focused entirely on Jake and Sarah. Sarah saw her first. Her heart stopped. She had to do something, create a diversion. She locked eyes with Jake, 1,000 messages passing between them in a single, desperate glance. She did the only thing she could think of. She screamed and hurled the heavy ledger straight at Thorne's head. The world exploded. The ledger hit Thorne in the shoulder, throwing off his aim just as he pulled the trigger. The shotgun blast roared, tearing a chunk out of the wall right next to Jake's head. Jake fired back, his own shot going wide. In the confusion, Dr. Evans lunged for the door, trying to escape. One of Thorne's men shot him in the back without a second thought. The doctor fell, his confession dying with him. The other gunman took aim at Sarah, but before he could fire, Emma let out a furious cry and charged, plunging the hunting knife into the back of the man's leg. He roared in pain, his shot going into the ceiling. Jake used the moment to tackle Thorne, the 2 big men crashing to the floor in a brutal, desperate struggle for the shotgun. Sarah didn't hesitate. She drew her pearl-handled Derringer, the small gun feeling heavy and powerful in her hand. She took aim at the remaining gunman, the one Emma had wounded, just as he was turning on the child. She fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The man crumpled to the ground. Now it was just Thorne and Jake, rolling on the floor, grunting and cursing. The shotgun skidded across the polished wood, coming to a stop just a few feet from Sarah. Thorne was stronger. He slammed Jake's head against the floor, dazing him. He scrambled for the shotgun. Sarah got there first. She scooped up the heavy weapon, her hands shaking, but her resolve like steel. She aimed it at Marcus Thorne's chest as he rose to his feet. He froze, staring at the woman he had so fatally underestimated. He saw not a preacher's widow, but an angel of vengeance. "It's over, Thorne," she said, her voice shaking but clear. He laughed, a ragged, ugly sound. "You won't shoot me. You're a woman of God." "God has nothing to do with this," Sarah said, and she pulled both triggers. The blast threw her backwards, but her aim was true. Marcus Thorne was lifted off his feet and slammed against the far wall, his reign of terror ending in a brutal, final instant. Silence descended on the room, thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Jake staggered to his feet, pulling Sarah into his arms. Then he went to Emma, who was standing frozen, the bloody knife still in her hand. He knelt before her, gently taking the knife and pulling her into a fierce, protective hug. "You're safe," he whispered over and over again. "We're safe." They had won. They had gotten justice for Mary and for Thomas. They had exposed the corruption that had poisoned their town, but they had done it with violence and blood. They had crossed a line from which there was no return. As sirens wailed in the distance, Sarah looked at Jake and his daughter, this strange, broken family she had fought for. She was no longer just the preacher's widow. She was a survivor, a fighter, a killer. And for the first time since she'd arrived in Montana, she felt like she was finally home. The aftermath was a storm they weathered together. The territorial marshal, a man beyond Thorne's reach, arrived from the capital. He listened to their story, saw the proof in the affidavit, and pieced together the bloody scene in Thorne's office. The official story became one of self-defense, of a corrupt empire crumbling under the weight of its own sins. Pine Ridge was free. The following spring, they were married. Not in the grand cathedral Thorne had planned to build, but in the small, simple church they had rebuilt with their own hands. The entire town was there, their faces filled with gratitude and respect. As Sarah stood at the altar, looking at Jake, she saw a man reborn. The haunted look was gone, replaced by a quiet strength and a deep, abiding love that was reflected in his daughter's smiling face. Emma stood between them, holding both their hands, no longer a ghost, but a bright, happy child. They had built a new life from the ashes of the old. They had faced down the devil and won. The frontier hadn't just tested them, it had forged them into something stronger, something unbreakable. As Jake slipped the ring on her finger, his voice was steady and sure. "I promise to love you through all seasons," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "Through the storms that test us and the quiet moments that sustain us. I promise to be the partner you deserve and the father Emma needs." When the new preacher pronounced them man and wife, Jake kissed her with a passion and a promise that sealed their future. They walked out of that church into the bright Montana sunshine, a family forged in hardship, tested by fire, and bound by a love that was stronger than grief, stronger than fear, and strong enough to last a lifetime. Behind them, the church bell, the same bell that had almost been their tomb, rang out, its clear, true sound carrying across the valley. It was a sound of hope, of new beginnings, of justice served, and a future reclaimed. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unforgettable tales from the untamed West. Click the video on your screen now to see what happens when a lone woman inherits a cattle drive and has to prove she's tougher than all the men who want to see her fail. Your support helps us keep these stories alive. Thank you for watching.